And this is an example of a broader phenomenon that we'll have to leave for another time, but there's a whole system of nested hierarchies going from the individual country to the sub-region to the region to the global economy that are worth looking at if you're going to have what I think is a mature analysis of who's influencing who and who's dominating who and why somebody is going to invade, as Saudi Arabia did Bahrain, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so just keep that in mind parenthetically. Adam Mia is the person you want to read. He's got several articles online which go over these trends that I've been summarizing. Okay, let me skip way ahead. I've skipped over most of the examples of the international connections. But for time's sake, I'm going to skip to the political implications. So we've got economies in the region which are more than ever tightly bound to the imperialist economies. We've got economies which are still, generally speaking, governed by dictatorships. Some of the more blatant features of the dictatorships have been done away with because of mass revolts in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere. But people are still fighting and dying in order to win those freedoms. So you still have varying social formations depending on which country you're talking about, where the existing deep state that's left over from the Bonapartist days of Nasser and the other bourgeois populists, in alliance with the secular and Islamist wings of the ruling class and their political representation, are still running the shot, and the workers and peasants in none of these countries are running the shot. And getting back to Vinen's book, as I mentioned, he talks about how the working class and the peasants, although they've been in the streets at every stage of this evolution, they have not yet formed a political formation which could lead them to victory, which could make them the masters of these economies. But one corollary of what I've been saying about the increasing internationalization of the economies of the Arab region is the greater potential than ever before for the formation of an Arab-wide economy and polity. For decades, people, really for centuries, people in the Arab world have been saying, we're really one nation. There is such a thing, or could be, as an Arab nation. And that, among other things, would allow us, the Arabs, if we formed one nation, to rationalize our economies. Instead of having Saudis doing the oil, and Lebanon doing the finance, and England doing the garments, and on and on and on, we could pool those resources and plan them democratically. Obviously, that is not going to happen without a working class revolution led by a working class party. So let me just conclude with three, keep track for me, 3 examples of why we have some hope that that can be. I'll wrap up in a couple minutes.
I think it'd take about 10 more minutes, actually.
Don't tell me. All right. Okay. Thanks. On one level, there are increasingly important union formations which are giving the working class a sense of their potential as a class in of and for themselves. And I say in of and for themselves in contrast to what Biden has outlined about the frequent appearance on the stage of working classes in these different countries, but not always in their own name. Sometimes as individuals in bread riots or other mass upsurges, sometimes against their employers, sometimes, but much more rarely, as a unified working class against a particular state or boss policy or action, but not consistently in their own name. Now, the UGTT in Tunisia is perhaps the brightest exception to this. The English version of what the acronym stands for, I believe, is the General Union of Tunisian Workers. I won't even try to say that in French. But the UGTT, for decades, has been the opposition force in Tunisia. It used to have a fairly bureaucratic leadership, and in the course of the revolution of the last couple of years, they have been increasingly shoved aside to the point where some people say that there's actually radicals running the federation. Even if that's an exaggeration, the UGTT policies are still very, very heavily influenced by the radicals in it who are increasingly coming together as a bloc, and some of whom are working very hard to form revolutionary parties. A similar phenomenon is happening in Egypt in terms of the formation of an independent union federation, the mass recruitment to the affiliated unions of the federation, and their increasing jump onto the stage of Egyptian politics. And I should mention here, and this will help me get to a theme I forgot about, one of the places where you see this most often in both Egypt and Tunisia, that is the unions coming to the fore, are in the more backward parts of the country. In the last month, for instance, most of the action in Egypt has not been in Tahrir Square in Cairo or anywhere else in Cairo, although there have been heroic actions there and people have been injured and killed there. But in terms of the masses involved and the radical nature of their action, it's been in the Suez area cities, in Port Said, etc., where workers have struck, where they have taken over, they've occupied factories and other workplaces, where they've shut down streets. The same is true in Tunisia and in Algeria, where some of the most militant actions in the last few months have been in the more backward parts of the country, backward economically, which is actually where the Tunisian revolution began. Now, I mentioned Algeria. One of the forces fighting in Algeria is a federation of the unemployed. And I don't know if I'll find their name flipping through it, but here we go. The National Committee for the Defense of the Rights of Unemployed. That's the group in Algeria which has been fighting for, as their name said, the rights of the unemployed. But they've been fighting specifically to eliminate the disparate unemployment levels across the country. Because in Algeria, as elsewhere, it's the hinterlands that are getting screwed more than anywhere else. So this is an example on just a national level of combined and uneven development, Trotsky's concept, which gets back to these nested hierarchies I mentioned when I was talking about Adam Hania, where you have not only a nation and a sub-region and a region and a global economy, but even within one particular country, there are disparate levels of development and as a result, disparate politics. Okay, so some of these forces that I've been mentioning, these independent unions, these more radical provincial formations are coming together in Tunisia for the World Social Forum next week. There's several tracks of workshops that are set up to try to gather these forces together and to organize solidarity with them on a global basis. And we'll keep you posted on all that. Some of our comrades in Tunisia are involved in that process. Finally, as I've mentioned in passing, for any of this to bear fruit, we need revolutionary parties, and we need coordination of revolutionary parties on a region-wide basis. Hopefully, there would even be a region-wide party as opposed to just a federation of parties. I mean, in theory, that's what an international is. It's one world party. People have different opinions about how that breaks out in terms of the autonomy of the sections, but there's no question that the Arab world as a whole needs a coordination of revolutionary parties, and to get to that stage needs to build revolutionary parties in the first place. And hopefully we can help them do that. That's it.
Well, we have time for discussion, questions from the audience, comments.
Can you, in less than 2 or 3 minutes, explain how the Sovereign Gulf State funds found the synthesis so quickly between the Rothschild and Warburg, right across the top tier of Africa?
Can you all hear him in the back? Not really. Could you say that louder, please?
Speak a little louder.
Speak louder. Could you, in a short, brief, concise response, explain how the synthesis of the sovereign wealth funds from around the Gulf mix in so well with Russia and Warburg financiers all across the top of Africa, except for Libya, and how this happened and can it be undone, or any interested in doing it, or there's a collaborative effect, so have its claws so deep they can't move.
2 or 3 together, and then it's fine.
Well, maybe in part of the discussion you could talk a little bit more about sort of the state of the workers' movement in Egypt today and Tunisia, and anyway, no, anecdotally it was.
Can we include at all, even though we have a
Yes, if you like.
Okay. Well, in terms of the sovereign funds, I have to plead ignorance because although they're very important, I don't want to pretend to know details about their size or their connections, except to say that that's probably the thing that Adam and Eve has done best at documenting. And it's a crucial time to look at where they are and what are their connections with Western banks. I will say, though, that it's important to look at those funds in the context of changes in global production. Because, and there's a huge debate among radicals of various sorts about the role of production versus finance today in the capitalist economy. And there was a similar overemphasis on the role of oil back in the 70s, where people said, oh, it's all about oil, and they're stealing our oil, or they want to control oil. And it was totally divorced from analysis of what was happening in the global economy as a whole, including shifts in production. Just to give one example today of how it's important not to get lost in the modern day equivalent, finance is hugely important in the Gulf, and Adam and Eve goes into great detail about that. And finance and the sovereign funds and the other manifestations of it are connected in part to oil, but they're also connected to shifts in global production. A friend on Facebook, for instance, posted an article a couple days ago about H&M and where its factories are and other big manufacturers. And turns out that there's huge sweatshops in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in Egypt, in Jordan, and all of that plays out on a strategic and political level as well. That is, well, I won't get down that road. I want to leave more time for discussion. But the point is that, to bring it back to the sovereign funds. So the finance capital in Saudi Arabia and in Lebanon and in some of the other Gulf countries, among other things, goes to build and expand these traditional manufacturing production sites. It's not just a free-floating entity, however important that is. Okay, in terms of Egypt and Tunisia and the unions, beyond the federations, well, let me say one thing about the Egyptian situation. I mentioned that there's an independent federation of Egyptian trade unions, which is challenging day by day, workplace by workplace, the old state-dominated federation, which still exists and which the Muslim Brotherhood still favors. And there's a huge fight over the proposed law for how a union would get recognized. And the proposed law favors the state-dominated federation. One of the means by which they want to do so is to say that there can only be one federation or affiliate of one federation in a given workplace. Now, those of us active in the U.S. trade union movement might instinctively say, well, we don't have one union in our workplace. But if you've ever read about unions in other countries, whether it be France or Latin America or whatever, they're very often contending unions, which actually have to fight for members and for members' loyalty, which is a good thing, generally speaking. But the regime in Egypt wants to deny that to the workers of Egypt. Okay, on Iraq, I'm so glad you said that. Because I'm becoming increasingly convinced that we have done the Iraqi people and ourselves a huge disservice by compartmentalizing the struggles, by looking at Iraq and the war against it over here, and the Middle East and North Africa over here, and Iran over there, and even though we say glibly, yeah, imperialism is screwing them all, and we've got to help them all and express solidarity, we really haven't looked at how they're connected to each other. And just taking it from the economic standpoint, because that's what I've stressed most today, one of the references I didn't get a chance to go into was about contending plans for pipelines. There are some plans to go from, I think it's Iraq to Iran to Pakistan. There's other plans to go from Iraq to Jordan to Lebanon, et cetera, et cetera. I'm probably garbling the routes, but there's different players. Each ruling class in the region has a different idea of who they want to line up with and what that means for the economy of their country and what it means in terms of potential strategic and political blowback from the various imperialist forces involved, whether that be European imperialists, Russia, the US, Saudi Arabia, etc. And the oil pipelines are just one of many potential examples in terms of the interconnectedness of the economies. And the point of all that is that when we do anti-war and solidarity work, in my opinion, it can no longer be just Egypt or just Tunisia or just the Middle East and North Africa. It must be that and Iraq and Iran and, in some occasions, and all of South Asia and on as a whole. Other comments, questions?
In terms of the elections in Egypt, I know that women overwhelmingly voted for the Muslim Brotherhood, and I've heard that explained as that there weren't a lot of options. You know, it was either the elements of the old regime or the Muslim Brotherhood. And I'm just wondering if there was any, if you know anything about the campaigns, about the campaign pitch that either one of them directed toward women to get them to vote for them. If there was any, like, it's still sort of hard for me to understand how women would do that. But I understand if those are the only options. We certainly have tons of lesser evilist arguments here, and people do it every day here. But I was just wondering if they made any particular pitches to women to overcome that barrier and say, we are the ones that you want.
I don't know, and that's important. What I do know is that people in a lot of progressive movements in Egypt saw the Brotherhood as a lesser evil to the candidates of the old regime, what they call the Fulul, the hangovers. Some of them regretted very soon thereafter. Others of them were a little more astute and said, well, it's a lesser evil, but we know we're going to have to be back out in the street fighting them the day after they take office. Others had a more revolutionary position and said, you can't vote for them even as a lesser evil because they're a bourgeois force. But my suspicion is that if the majority of women voted for the Brotherhood, it was from the same general lesser evilism. Having said that, we should research it and find out exactly what the pitch was. But I will say that there is a growing women's movement in Egypt, and one of the most heroic examples of it is a group, and I'm ashamed to say I forgot an exact name, I think it's in my article in the current issue, a group of women who came together to fight the growing harassment and violent attacks in Tahrir Square in Cairo. Attacks which everybody knows have been inspired and provoked by the regime and its party. And they have organized in an amazing way to defend women who are coming under attack. And even in terms of combining, physical self-defense with counseling right there on the spot for the women who need it. And I think that's symptomatic of burgeoning feminist organizing in general and women's participation in unions, including in Mahala, in the textile center, which from day one was majority women, including the leadership. Anyways, but we should find out. That's important. Exactly how the Brotherhood. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Exactly how the Brotherhood pitched their appeal. There's an obit in today's Times and in other papers. That's I just happened to see, and I've forgotten her name, but it's a woman who was a Hamas supporter in Gaza, who's known as the Mother of Martyrs, who just died, I think, of cancer. And she had 3 sons who participated in resistance actions against the Zionist regime. And of course, the Western press baited her as an Islamic fundamentalist. How can you be a mother when you send your kids to death, blah, blah, blah. Millions of people in Palestine and around the world see her instead as a resistance fighter. I mean, I'm not going to get into the tactics of what her sons did. There were actually 3 totally different scenarios. But the point is that coincidentally, in terms of when she died, and you're raising this question today, given that the Brotherhood represents a certain social phenomenon, that is bourgeois leadership at the top, and a middle class and working class base, like any other huge populist party, you're going to have huge numbers of women drawn into it for similar reasons. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, my name is Christoph from the International Bolshevik Tendency, and I just want to make a few brief remarks in relation to worker self-management and the nature of the state. Andrew mentioned the worker self-management, and obviously I cannot anticipate the results of your forthcoming research, which I'm sure will be interesting. John Modell is a good source, I guess. But the worker self-management that you refer to in Algeria, no doubt was an expression of an upsurge of the working class, of increased confidence, and the attempts in rudimentary form to take control of things that the workers could, i.e. the points of production. However, I think I would want to warn against deducing from the existence of worker self-management a change in the character of the state. I believe you don't argue that, I just want to point it out, because worker self-management can exist under all kinds of societies of different natures. I would argue that the worker self-management in those days in Algeria was within an still existing capitalist regime, because the capitalist framework had not been overturned by the revolution. Unlike, for example, worker self-management that occurred in Yugoslavia, where during the Second World War, the guerrilla forces of Tito actually managed to destroy the existing weak bourgeois regimes, the Ustasha state, and managed to establish a degenerated worker state. But nevertheless, it was a state that was based on a very different kind of economy, if you like, a post-capitalist economy. There was worker self-management in that society too, but I would argue that was under a different kind of framework. So I think if we want to draw a comparison between the Algerian self-management that you refer to and something that might be closer to us, perhaps it is the worker self-management we have seen in Venezuela over the last decade or so, which is very much controlled and limited also by the state. It is one that is not really the kind of worker self-management that we might want to think of when we think of socialist society or a state that is truly run by workers. So in that sense, I think we have to put the worker self-management into the framework of the actual nature of the state at the time.
If I could respond directly to that, we'll take the next question, because I agree with you completely. And just a couple examples to go further. I mentioned Joe Hanson's reporting from Algeria. He wrote a couple documents about the experiment in Algeria and about Egypt, countering people who thought that there had been a worker state established in one or both of those countries, and claiming that one or both of them had leaderships which somehow, supposedly, did what Castro did in terms of shifting politics. And he blows that apart. And he not only goes after those who isolated worker self-management from the question of the state, but he also looked at the sweeping nationalizations in Egypt and elsewhere and stressed correctly, it's not just a quantitative question of how much industry you have nationalized, but is there still a ruling class and does it still control the state? And in Egypt, as we've seen in subsequent decades, it obviously did, and the army, by the way, which itself overlaps with the ruling class in personnel, still controls 30 to 40% of the economy. One last thing, why I'm so glad you raised this question of worker self-management. Some people are not only exaggerating its significance in Venezuela, and I don't want to minimize it, but the fact of the matter is that worker self-management is still an isolated phenomenon in Venezuela, and the attitude of the state, the various wings of the state toward it, have been all over the map, and certainly not an attitude that would lead it toward empowering workers to go after seizure of power. But the other danger is the growing anarchist obsession with isolated examples of worker self-management. I mean, Morena Citrin is always going on and on about how Argentina proves that you can set up your own little economy over here on the side. An example with more objective potential, which I'm afraid would be sidetracked if it buys into this anarchist obsession, are some experiments in Greece and Egypt and solidarity between them. There's, I think it's a steel factory in Egypt and a newspaper in Greece. I may have them all mixed up. But they exchange greetings with each other in support of each other's occupation. And it's not clear whether they see it as, in either country, as leading toward a movement which would challenge the ruling class itself, or as an isolated example. I think it's the one in Egypt which openly admitted that they were financing the continuing production in their plants by cutting their wages in half. So, I mean, for time's sake, I'm not going to get into what that says about the whole project of isolated workers' utopias. Anybody else who hasn't? Go ahead. Dan and then Chris.
Well, I guess just touching on the Muslim Brotherhood, there has been this whole tension between, not tension, but opposition between Arab nationalism and Muslim. I mean, I guess you call it Muslim nationalism of a certain sort, and in Egypt, it definitely is quite clear that the class basis of the party that really, and I think you had a good characterization in the article, which I'm now forgetting, but the Islamist part came second. I mean, the class nature is more fundamental. The religious nature is really more of a machine on the whole thing.
Well, good for her.
But and I guess this is when we're running more into, for instance, in Pakistan, where you do see manifestations of opposition to imperialism that take an Islamic form, and often in organizations that not only are often in opposition to the left, but often physically assault, working class organizations. And I think it can be kind of disorienting for people because there is this sort of sense of uniting large numbers of people across countries. There's a certain internationalism to it, and a certain opposition to imperialism. Anything you could do to comment on, what distinguishes, or just how to understand this phenomenon in contrast or in relation to Arab nationalism, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about Marty's question, and this isn't an answer by any means, but I think part of the answer certainly has to be stepping back and looking what the Mubarak regime meant to women in terms of economics. I know Joe Biden had a book on Egypt that talked a great deal about what the Mubarak regime's adoption of a neoliberal program and their concrete response to the demands of the World Bank and the IMF, what that meant particularly for women in Egypt. And of course, the Nasser regime, or maybe that's a little foggy in my head, but there was a massive development of a massive state sector with public works programs that incorporated very large numbers of women into the world of public work. Many of them were rural women who were brought in to fill these positions and so forth. And I think that's probably just one example of how the old secular regime, the army, etc., were associated with devastating economic, impact on women and the family and children. And the Muslim Brotherhood, on the other hand, which was an opposition group and who builds its mass lumpen lower working class and middle class base on private religious social service and the whole notion of solving the tremendous